Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mark Fowler, and I'm the CEO of the Tanenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding. On behalf of our team, I'd like to welcome you all to our 5th annual Religious Diversity Leadership Summit and our first virtual summit. And we're glad that you're joining with us today. I'd like to begin with what's known as a land acknowledgement, which is an intentional naming of this space in which we live and work, and it's part of a broader effort to decolonize our gathering spaces. Like any of you tuning in from New York City, where Tanenbaum's offices are located, we find ourselves living, working, and connecting on the ancestral lands of the Munsee Lenape Nation. We pay respect to the elders, past and present, who care for this region, and we acknowledge that, like so many, we have the privilege of resources from ceded and unceded land and from the settler colonial system. And we'll be dropping a link in the chat so you can identify the Indigenous connection of where you are at this moment, noting that this is not only limited to the United States. I'd also like to acknowledge that this session is taking place during the holy month of Ramadan, a time of fasting, prayer, reflection, and charity for Muslims around the world. From all of us at Tanenbaum, we wish you Ramadan Mubarak. Tanenbaum, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with our work, is a secular and non-sectarian not-for-profit. Our mission is to combat religious prejudice, promote justice, and build respect for religious difference. We do this in 4 primary program areas, and in education, we work with teachers and school systems around creating inclusive learning environments and reducing bullying. We work in healthcare, where we provide training and resources to doctors, nurses, medical providers, as well as healthcare systems on the ways in which patients and families make decisions that are based in their religious beliefs and practices. In our peace building work, we identify and raise the profile of religiously motivated peace actors working in conflict zones around the world. And in our workplace work, we work with global corporations, large companies, and not-for-profits on their policies and practices, the training for managers, interactions among colleagues, and looking at the impact of religious diversity, inclusion, and belonging in the workplace, the workforce, and the marketplace. Our theme this year is Do the Work, Build a Bigger Table. We wanted to explore ways to take things deeper and to dive more into the realm of action in terms of what comes next. And our intention is that you walk away with, at the end of this session and every session we have, more insight, knowledge, and skills to do the work to build that bigger table in every setting, space, or situation in which you find yourself. I'd also like to ask you that if you have questions during the course of this presentation and during Sarah's keynote, to please include them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I'd also like to acknowledge our sponsor for today's summit and for the summit overall, the Walt Disney Company. The Walt Disney Company has been sponsors of our summit every year since the first one 6 years ago. We had to skip a year last year, and they regularly sponsored the summit, and the Walt Disney Company is also one of our corporate leaders. So we're very grateful for their continued support and partnership. And now to the work of the day, I would like to introduce to you our keynote speaker for this year's Religious Diversity Leadership Summit, Sarah Eaglehart. Sarah is the ideal person to speak about building a bigger table, because her life and work are very clearly about building not just a bigger table, but a more inclusive and just table, where the dignity of every human being and their stories are respected. Sarah is an Emmy-winning social justice storyteller, activist, media strategist, and producer focused on advocacy on behalf of Indigenous peoples. She is an internationally accomplished executive with a diverse background in tribal, corporate, and nonprofit organizations. Her creative projects are rooted in her worldview as an Oglala Lakota raised on Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, supporting narrative change for healing and impact. Sarah is co-founder and co-CEO of Return to the Heart Foundation, focused on resourcing Indigenous women-led initiatives. Prior to this role, she served as CEO of Native Americans in Philanthropy, a national nonprofit that focuses on investment in Native American communities. She has organized national narrative change movements for Native Americans with a wide variety of notable celebrities and grassroots allies. Sarah has also had a big impact in the faith-based world, serving as the team leader for diversity, social justice, and environmental ministries and program officer for Indigenous Ministry of the Episcopal Church during the tenure of presiding Bishop Catherine Jeffords Scory. During this time in 2009, the Episcopal Church became the first major denomination to repudiate the doctrine of discovery. Sarah has supported multiple denominations in their repudiations of the doctrine of discovery, including the World Council of Churches in 2012. In addition to all of this, Sarah is a new author. She contributed to the feminist anthology, This Is How We Come Back Stronger. She is also co-authoring a self-help memoir titled Warrior Princesses Strike Back with her twin sister, psychotherapist Emma Eaglehart White, which will be published by Feminist Press in early 2022. Sarah, it is our joy and privilege to have you with us, and I turn this over to you.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm just so excited to be here, sharing what I know with everybody. So first, let me start with our traditional greeting, Ampechi Washte, Wamwishinawi Amachiapi, Chante Washte Nape Achievzape, which means my name is actually Eagle Shawl Woman, which is my Lakota name. And I just said, good day, and I greet you with a good heart. I'm Ogallala Lakota. I was raised on Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, and as you can see from that super long biography, I have really felt called all over the place from, a little tiny church in Pensacola, Florida, which I think was was definitely a calling, because prior to that, I had worked at an Indian casino outside of San Diego. So I went from casino to church pretty quickly, and then spent over a decade working for the Episcopal Church, from this little church into the staff of the presiding bishop, and working cross-culturally. What I learned, I would say, just in a capsule, is that storytelling is really important to the education of just America, really, and the world, about this history that still is impacting us. And I think for many years, it was a history that we chose, many times, to sweep under the rug, or to say that doesn't matter. But I now, in this moment of, time's up, a moment of, George Floyd, of COVID, it's a reality that we really can't ignore anymore. We see the line, and so the through line. And part of what I feel like Creator has been asking me to do has been really to follow this pathway, which has taken me all over the place. And I would have never in a million years imagined that I would win an Emmy with John Legend. That's just ridiculous. My younger self that grew up on the res would have never imagined that. As I sat on the couch watching Oprah, that Oprah would have been in the actual virtual reality production as well, that I would meet Oprah, right? So for me, it's really just this road that I feel is really important to educate our community and the people about this, but actually to move forward. So I'm really thankful to Tanenbaum for giving me this platform. And that being said, we're going to move pretty quickly, because I always find that there's just a lot that people don't know. And what I would ask you to do is that I am not going to be paying attention to the chat during this conversation. this presentation. But I would really, really, really ask that as you're learning new information, as you are reflecting upon the presentation, that you comment or reflect upon what you know or don't know. And then also, think about, things that really impact you, things that are transformative. Because I would like it to be a somewhat of a reflective presentation as well. So we are going to just jump right into it. So Madakuya Oyase, this is the Lakota Amen. It means we are all related, we are all connected. It is something that I have said since I was a little child. And when I reflect upon this phrase as an adult, I think about how this phrase taught me from the very beginning that I was connected to humanity, of course, but also the two-legged, the four-legged, the winged, and Mother Earth, and spirituality, right? So, I remember working at the Episcopal Church, and I would work with my colleagues. I was always working in partnership. I was always working cross-culturally. And one of the things that one of my colleagues reflected to me, she said, when I work with Native Americans, it's like they can go deep immediately. And I said, yeah, it's because Creator has always been there, right? So for us, Creator has been there since the very beginning. But we have this history, right? Martin Luther King said, our nation was born in genocide when it embraced the doctrine that the Indian was an inferior race even before there were large numbers of Negroes on our shores. The scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society from the 16th century forward. Blood flowed in battles over racial supremacy. We are perhaps the only nation which tried as a matter of national policy to wipe out the indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated that tragic experience into a noble crusade. Indeed, even today, we have not permitted ourselves to reject or to feel remorse for this shameful episode. Our literature, our films, our drama, our folklore, all exalted. And it does, it has, historically. And one of the really important things to just sit with this saying, right, that came from Martin Luther King, obviously an ally to Native Americans, obviously seeing and comparing history and also sharing his platform to say, hey, this has happened to the first peoples of this land. And as I think of George Floyd and the post George Floyd, where we saw the removal of some racist mascots like the R-word NFL team, I am very grateful to Black organizers who in that moment started to say over and over, Black and Indigenous, Black and Indigenous, Black and Indigenous, every time they were on TV. And because of that, things changed. But we still have a lot of work to do. So we're gonna go through some of this history. But first, I also wanna call your attention to 4 levels of oppression and change. We have the personal, the interpersonal, the institutional, and the cultural. All of these different levels of oppression and change, I have heard these arguments in different settings of, why are you mad? We're honoring you. The hierarchy of institutions, right? You should just change your religion, right? For a long time, we couldn't even practice our own religion until the 1970s. It was illegal. That wasn't that long ago. So I want to also call your attention to this because I'm not just talking about, I'm talking about everything today. You yourself, what you can do at your institution, but also how you could help to share and think about how am I contributing to the invisibility and erasure of Native Americans. There's little things, there's big things, right? But there's also, would love for you to think about how can I also change this? What policies can I implement? So the propaganda of racism, sexism, spiritual degradation, and dehumanization. I call your attention to Manifest Destiny and the doctrine of discovery, right? Manifest Destiny said the inherent right to conquer and rule a people. That's what it said. That's what Doctrine of Discovery is. It was repudiated back by the Episcopal Church, who was the first Episcopal Church to do it in 2009. I was on the staff of the presiding bishop at that time. I worked with the leaders who actually made this happen. And then the World Council of Churches also repudiated the Doctrine of Discovery in 2012. I also want to call your attention to the propaganda of just America, right? We sing these songs like "This Land Is Your Land," and I know people will say, well, that was actually a rebel song. And yes, it was, but at the same time, it disregarded Native Americans. So we, it's basically saying all this land is your land, right? For me, it reinforces this theory that, people that came to America had the divine right to conquer and rule the people, that God said it was important that you could do this. And everyone is benefiting from it. Flash forward to, in the 1994, there's me on the right. I was protesting the warrior mascot at my high school. I went to a border town high school to the reservation, and this border town high school had a homecoming ceremony, and the homecoming ceremony had a big chief, a medicine man, and 5 warrior princesses. And the medicine man danced around the women who were mostly non-native white people. In my community, that's all it was white people and native people. And they would give the gift. They would go, the medicine man dance around them, and he would choose one by looking in her mouth and her ears and manually weighing her. So it was very, very sexist. If you didn't, of everything, right? Like, they should have seen that it was very sexist. but that is an event that they did for 57 years. And when we protested in 1994, the whole town was mad. It was like 1,100 people in my very rural tribal, community. The town was 1,100 people. The tribal community actually surrounded the entire county, right? But for whatever reason, this little pocket, this little county was very disconnected from the Native American communities all around it, and performed something like this for 57 years. So they were very mad when we said, hey, this is not cool. Can you just respect us? and it's so cute when I think back to that, because we were so young, but we knew that the Creator, we had this intuition and this knowledge that told us we had to do something. It was the beginning of a 4-year protest that would end, only because they got tired of us coming back and disrupting the whole show every year. Then you look at what we're looking at now. Okay, we have the Redskins, the Braves, the Indians, and of course, we're in the middle of wanting to get rid of all of these. All of these need to go. But it's the dehumanization of Native people. And for many people, they're like, what? We're honoring you. It's not an honor if you're dehumanizing us. And I think it's important to say that, because when this leads to other issues, I think it's very important to acknowledge this history. And so this is just a quick little, I want to show you the land loss by time, the Native American land loss of since the beginning, and the Indian reservations that are currently present. And I'm going to keep going to also what I would call the results of propaganda. So the image on the right is where the states that required a mask mandate, notice that South Dakota is in the dark red. And that's where I'm coming to from today, actually. Pahasapa, the Black Hills, the land of the Ocheti Shakoi, the 7 Council Fires. And then you go over to the right and you see a very recent graph of the COVID-19 death rate by race and ethnicity. American Indian and Alaska Native have the highest population, but you should also notice that Arizona is in that list, right? There's a lot of Oklahoma, there's a lot of states where Native people are present that have also died because there was no mask mandate in place. So in many ways, it felt like we were sitting ducks. And then you add on to this, the other day, I was looking up poverty rates, and I'm writing another book. And so I was looking up poverty rates, and I was really struck by the fact that when you look at the top 20, and I was actually looking for Ogallala, Lakota County, because it's always in the top 10 or top 20. So now they're at number 13 for the lowest per capita personal income. And what I noticed was that there's also number 2 is Cheyenne River and Standing Rock Reservation. Then I noticed that, number 3 is Crow Creek Reservation, also in South Dakota. I noticed that Todd County from South Dakota, which is also there, there is on the list as well. And then everyone else is a correctional facility, except for 2 counties, one in Georgia and one in Texas. And that really struck me like a chord that, historically Native American reservations were prison camps. That was where we were forced to relocate in the very beginning. And to see that we still have the highest jail admission rates is very, very shocking still to me. I mean, I feel like for so long, people have been working against this, but to see as recently as 2016 that Native Americans are still, dealing with the highest rates in prison in states like South Dakota. So before I click on this video, I just want to say that before you go into a shame spiral, which I often find happens a lot, is that people are shocked. I mean, I'm shocked, right? And a lot of times when I think about how long I've been working on just education, and I remember when I was younger, I was in my late 20s and my early 30s, I said to myself, I would, have friends that were older Native American priests, and they always seemed really angry to me. And I always thought to myself, wow, I don't want to be a bitter person, like angry and bitter, like that's not who I want to be. But at this stage in my life, now I'm 42, and I think to myself, I'm like, I get why they were mad. I get it now. Because when you're doing all of this educational work for so long, it can feel very isolating, and that you're not really making a dent in anything. And that we are still, even as the first people of this land, we are still fighting for equity and for visibility and for justice for our people. And when we see those rates, the prison rates happening of our community, my children who are, young men, they still have to worry about the cops following them, and so even for my own children and many of my friends' children, this is something that is perpetual for us, and something has to change. But here, I want to give you a snapshot of this video that we're going to move into the transformation and a little bit about my background of work. In Lakota society, we're really taught that everybody's a leader and that everybody has, the opportunity to help their people. When I began to tell my story of my own childhood, of growing up in a very rural area, a place that was very poverty-stricken, I felt really empowered to be able to use that storytelling as a way to transform hearts. Our organization, Native Americans in Philanthropy, has been focusing on advocacy to level out the playing field for Native Americans. For me, part of that is working in unconventional ways. We brought 1,000 women to the Women's March to educate and advocate on behalf of access to health care, violence against the earth, violence against women, and education. So it was really a sacred experience.
In recognition of her commitment and outstanding leadership, I would like to present Sarah with this award.
Anybody can do this work. It doesn't matter where you come from. It doesn't matter, your socioeconomic status. Making change is hard. But if I can tell this story that's a transformative story that can really get to somebody's heart and can push them to impact, to make change, then that's what I want to do. So I want to jump into some terminology. That was a little snippet of Indigenous worldview, so you get a little bit of a background of where I'm coming from. And also understanding that Native Americans understand the world and the meaning of life in terms of nature, and that nature and space are indissociably linked to thought and experience. This worldview orients Natives' spatial concepts of natural cycles, seasons, harvest cycles, moon patterns, etc. We therefore see our responsibility as living harmonious and balanced in relation with all creation, including other tribes and racial ethnic communities. In contrast, Western Europeans understand the world and the meaning of life in terms of history and tend to orient their life towards the future, goals, destiny, final purpose. This worldview reflects temporal concepts of progress, development, and colonization. And what I would say is that also a big difference is Native people our worldview as Indigenous people is that we think collectively versus Western European individualistic, nuclear family. Those are some big differences. Our original instructions refer to the diverse teachings, lessons, ethics expressed in the origin stories and oral tradition. So they are passed from generation to generation on how to be a good human being living in a reciprocal relationship with all of our relatives. And these original instructions celebrate our interdependence and our interconnection with the diversity of life and one another. And I also want to acknowledge that some people are blessed and fortunate and privileged to learn these original instructions, like myself, who I learned from my grandma and my great grandma growing up in my community. But many are maybe not able to have that same type of relationship with their homeland, their elders, their kinship. And so really understanding the place and learning is really critical. And sometimes I see people, they want to understand language and, and identity. And I think it's important to understand, to ask deeper questions. Where are you from? And Native people, we have this, we have the ability to do that with one another. Like, where are you from? Who's your family? We ask all of these questions because we want to be able to also place them within our society. How we survive genocide is really the cultural connection and connectedness of our people. This is Indigenous Life Course Protective Factors. This is all for Native youth, but I think it also goes for adults as well. But it was a report that I commissioned while I was at Native Americans in Philanthropy. I'm no longer there, but this report is important because it also shares that family connectedness was huge and a predictor for mental health and wellness, that community control over land, natural resources, our Indigenous institutions, governance, ancestral courts, that having the ability to have sustainable economies and self-governance relationship was really critical. And also having access to spirituality and ceremonies was really important for the success of this youth. And this report was actually commissioned because I was tired of seeing reports that were only deficit based, and I wanted to see something that was asset based. So these definitions come from that. So extended kinship bonds and networks are important because for us, our our extended family is actually considered our immediate family. So all of my aunties and uncles are like my mothers and fathers. And so for me, that's my family. Having access to healthy foods is really important. We know that more than ever post-COVID, right? That taking care of our microbiome and also safeguarding traditional medicines is critical. And then also allowing youth to have, to develop capacities that promote confidence and competence is really, really important. Here's a quick video from Women's March. So our prayers and our ceremony is really important for us to keep, you know, today. And that song is a prayer song for the missing, murdered Indigenous women, which is also an epidemic that we see that's happened to our own women that have gone missing and are still missing. And this epidemic where we don't actually know the numbers of the missing Indigenous women. And if this was happening to any other racial group, I think it would be different. But for us, the invisibility leads to continuing problems, which is why it was really important for me. Honestly, I started getting tired of it taking so long. I was there educating group by group, person by person, and I started to see that there was an opportunity for us to work with different influencers, and I got to be really great friends with people like Taboo, who took us to the Video Music Awards to share the work and the information about missing, murdered Indigenous women. And then I met people like Mark Ruffalo, who is also just a huge advocate now. And he stepped up in just major ways to help support Indigenous people. And then John Legend, his studio, Baobab Studios, did the project with me, a virtual reality project, Crow the Legend, that Oprah was on. Women's March, obviously, I'm now on the board. I would say they made a huge move forward. They did not have anybody on their board in their beginning. They didn't have anybody on their conveners table in the beginning. And when we said, hey, you don't have anybody on your board, they were like, you're right, we don't. Let us make room for you. And they actually made room for several of us. And of course, Anne Hathaway, who did a land acknowledgement during her Hollywood Walk of Fame star ceremony. Like, she didn't have to do that, but she did it because she really wanted to use that important moment to be able to say that this land does not belong to us. It belongs to the Tongva people. And then of course, it just all goes back to working for the Episcopal Church and being on the staff of presiding Bishop Catherine Jeffers Shorey. And that's along with Irma Visner, who is a former tribal leader of White Earth, who were huge allies and advocates. And presiding Bishop Catherine Jeffers Shorey, she went to the UN and she went to the Doctrine of Discovery hearing, basically, and listened to the testimony and shared her time to do that. And that was huge. Many people don't understand her witnessing the atrocities of what happened to the Indigenous peoples worldwide as a result of the Doctrine of Discovery, but her presence there and then our church sharing our own statement was huge. And then looking at Indigenous knowledge, which is really critical to saving Mother Earth. So I want to make the case that it's more important now than ever to understand this wisdom. we are the climate justice warriors of today, that we have the solutions to care for Mother Earth, that our matriarchal worldview distinguishes us as caretakers, not consumers of the land, and actualizing solutions grounded in native wisdom. And our storytellers hold real power, and they provide this deep ancestral knowledge that we need to live in relationship with the land. And in partnership, we can lift up and shift the forefront to the voices carrying healing for climate and for our planet. My organization works to build and bring these climate innovations that are rooted in ancestral indigenous knowledge that regards the earth, water, air, and plants as relatives. And we work to actually work with those grassroots people through fellowships, to use their knowledge to champion climate solutions, narrative change, civic engagement, and restorative and regenerative development. Additionally, I really felt like I needed to lift this up because, you know, I think many times it's like we get bored and we move on to the next thing, we move on to the next thing. But I'm really worried about ecofascism right now. And that there are actually groups out there that blame BIPOC people and immigrants for overproduction and resource utilization. And so these massacres that we are seeing are coming from these white nationalists who believe in these views. And the common link is this link between a yearning for purity in the environmental sphere and is desired for racial purity in the social sphere. So Pete Stademeyer said that from Marquette. And the racial crisis in the US is specifically based on the birth of our country and the government that took places and people and decimated those that stood in its way. In order for us to heal and build, we need to shift that narrative so that we can make a difference by sharing the stories that will change the world. And social and environmental movements need to partner with BIPOC communities to get there. So far, it's not happening. Actually, we can do more, but it's not happening. There is a recent pledge that was the Climate Justice Funders Pledge from the Donors of Color Network that basically called upon all of the justice groups to, you know, increase their funding to BIPOC-led groups to at least 30%. And so here are the funders that said yes, that took the pledge: Kresge, JPB, Pisces, Schmidt family. And actually they just announced Open Society have also taken the pledge, Seventh Generation, Meyer Memorial Trust, Libra, Grove, Chorus, David Rockefeller, Tides, Bullet, Nathan Cummings, Northlight, and Surdna. And I just want to name that because I think that I know we have a lot of corporations on this group and nonprofits and everything. I think there could be such a movement if many of you join the pledge as well. So I call that out there. And then we're gonna like wrap everything up in a nice pretty bow where you know, I share a little snippet of the VR project, virtual reality project, where we won an Emmy for outstanding interactive media 2 years ago, actually.
Crow? Crow's here?
The story is that there was a permanent spring on the earth and the weather was perfect, and winter comes upon the earth and the animals get together and try to decide what to do about it.
Someone must fly to the one who creates everything by thinking.
Moths can fly.
Yeah, but you just fly right into the sun.
They need to send the crow because he can fly. And in his trip, he has to make some sacrifices, but the sacrifice is what saved his community.
I know he'll make any sacrifice to save us.
It's a really amazing experience because it just makes you feel like really emotionally connected to everybody.
Let's see what you're really made of.
What resonates with me in this story is that we're a community that is diverse and that our differences also make us stronger and make us more unified.
So the 2D version is available on YouTube, but it's also, the VR version is available on all the different headsets for free, including Oculus. And this is me unboxing the Emmy with my grandma and the little tribal community hut house that I grew up in. And My grandma's 85 years old, and she thankfully made it through COVID. And, we're very worried about losing our elders. And I took this home to unbox with her from California. And so this is that moment.
That's so crazy.
Grandma, look at my award.
Whoa. What does it say?
It says 2018-2019 Daytime Emmy Awards, Outstanding Interactive Media for a Daytime Program, Crow the Legend, Baobab Studios, Sarah Eagleheart, consulting producer.
Yeah! An Emmy!
Grandma, what do you think?
Is it heavy?
Yes! She said, I'm crying. That's what she said. Of course, I have to do a plug for this, for my books, but as we're closing out, what I wanted to say is that our communities are really still struggling, right? But there are moments where I believe corporations can really step up and help. And Crow the Legend as an example of a studio that is actually Asian run and owned, that said, hey, we want to do it the right way, right? So they brought me on as a consultant producer. I also played the voice of the moon, by the way. But they said, we want to make sure that Native Americans are included in every way and on this project, and gave me that opportunity. The other thing that I want to say is that, there's little things that we can do, just as learning terminology for Native Americans, learning the history, learning about holidays, like our own holidays, like solstice is coming up. I'm really excited about that. Our organization is doing a summer solstice event this year, a live stream where we invite a bunch of artists to come on and help us raise money. We're doing stuff for post-COVID. But I just want to thank you for your time today, and for Tanenbaum for having me. And I look forward to hearing some of the questions and the books, by the way, that are out there. The one it's at Feminist Press. So this is how we come back stronger, which is a feminist anthology, a post-COVID anthology. So you can find that on Feminist Press website. And then I have a book that's coming out that I'm writing. I'm finishing the manuscript right now, but it's a self-help memoir that I'm writing with my identical twin sister, who's also a psychotherapist. And we decided to share Indigenous worldview from our lens to not only help our people, but also to help other people understand that perspective of what it's like to grow up in those communities and do everything right. So thank you so much, Madakuya Oyase, and I guess we're doing Q&A now.
We are doing Q&A now, Sarah, but before we get to that, I just have to, first of all, I have a hand cramp from trying to write notes for a presentation that I know I'm going to be able to look at tomorrow, but what you have shared with us in this time is so rich and so important on a variety of levels. I first just want to offer my thanks, not to what you've given us, but to who you are in the world and who you've been in the world and the space that you're making for others to be themselves. So our thanks to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. And there were a couple of things that stood out so prominently from your presentation today. I think one of them that I'm taking away is the shame spiral. So I don't know if I've ever heard that language before, and I just want to lift that up for us all to just be looking at, where does that moment of shame actually come in for us that distracts us from the work that we see to do, whether that's on the personal level or the interpersonal and the four different areas that you talked about. And I also loved what you were talking about, the idea of people saying, "What we're honoring you," and it almost being code for "we're including you." And many of the people who are joining us for our summit today and over the next sessions are people who do work around diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility for all identifiers. And there's a lesson for us to be aware of there, that when we say to people that we're honoring them, are we actually including and including their story and their experience? And I think the other thing that I very much resonated with was just the exhaustion that you talked about, that it seems was in a number of instances, the kind of kernel to introduce this new idea or to take what you were doing to another level. So I just want to thank you for those few insights that have resonated with me and will stay with me long past this presentation today. I see that there are some questions coming in, so I'm going to pose these to you and ask everyone that if you do have questions for Sarah, please do enter them into the Q&A feature, and I'd be happy to answer them. So there is a question here from Jackie, who says, I live in Wisconsin, where we have a noticeable Indigenous population. What advice do you have for those of us working to embrace Indigenous religious needs in our workspaces?
Yeah, so I actually, a lot of my life has been much of being a bridge builder. And one of the things that I wanted to say is that there are some of us that like being bridge builders, right? And there are some people that are way too tired and they're like, no, I don't have time to be bridge building and teaching everybody everything, right? So I just think it's important to also to take the time to learn and the venues that you have to learn, because I know that there are many tribes that do work with other communities or have forums, and part of it is just getting tuned into your community of who's doing what in that community. And also, I mean, I do want to send a prayer out for Oneida, Wisconsin, who actually just yesterday had a mass shooting in their casino. So these mass shootings are hitting closer to home. And yeah, that happened in Oneida, Wisconsin, and Green Bay, Wisconsin. And so my twin sister actually married an Oneida guy, and they have 3 beautiful kids, and they live in Green Bay, Wisconsin. So I know a lot about that area, but I think it's important to hear about that. I also see a question about our memoir. Sorry.
Yes, so there are a number of people who want to know where they can follow up to find out and to get notification when your memoir is released. And I can just tell you now as well, we'll be interviewing you when the memoir releases. So there'll be at least one moment where we'll partner again, but I think people actually want to know outside of the Tanenbaum where they might find out about the memoir.
So I do have a website where you can sign up for the newsletter. You can go to saraheaglehart.com and you'll be directed to my new website. So that's my personal website there. And also we're hoping for self-help season. So January 2022 is where we're shooting for.
There are no open questions right now, but I did have a question. So one of the things that I spend a lot of time on at Tanenbaum is creating resources around holidays and celebrations. And I think we try to be very careful in not homogenizing people's experiences, and with any holiday trying to talk about the global differences, the regional differences, how and why people celebrate. I wondered if you could say a word about not just the holidays, but how do we, how do we be really specific when we are raising Indigenous peoples' holidays for employers to think about, both in terms of their workforces, but also in terms of clients and customers? Could you just say a word about that? Because we don't want to homogenize, like every Indigenous person is celebrating this. How do we actually get to the specifics?
Again, it goes back to like knowing your community. So, like when you do your land acknowledgement and you go to nativeland.ca and you find out who are your tribal communities in your area, right? You can also dig in deeper and do some research about those tribal communities and their history and what they're currently celebrating in contemporary times. Because you're right, you can't, like, not everybody celebrate solstice, although many of us do. And, but it's, and things like, I mean, it's funny because things like Columbus Day, right? For like the longest time, I mean, we're just beginning to see a shift in that to Indigenous Peoples Day. But that's really recent. It's actually like only within maybe the last 5-10 years. So there's been a movement of, ensuring that we can be equitable. But
Yeah.
I would say that the thing that's really fascinating to me is when I was talking to my cousin, the HR friend, I'm not going to say where he lives, but suffice it to say, he works at a really big organization that has hundreds of thousands of employees, and he grew up in the same community that I did. And what he reflected upon to me is that there are things that people just don't know. So things like, so terminology like powwows. I'm just gonna go powwow, right? And he's like, and then he says, I think, do you even know what a powwow is? It's actually like a cultural celebration. So when you say you're gonna go powwow, it's not appropriate. And then other terminology like half-blood, are you full-blood or half-blood? I actually think that's a really offensive question, to be honest, because it's quantifying your blood like a dog or a horse. And so I want to just raise that up as kind of a don't do that. That's not cool. But also, and the thing about identity is that identity is very different from each group as well. And so even in the storytelling space, it's authentic storytellings. What story are you telling? If you're telling a story about the reservation, is that person actually from that reservation? Are they telling somebody else's story, and so things like that. And of course, like Cherokee Princess, stuff with Cherokee Princess is coming out too all over the place. And there's a whole history with that too. And there's different levels of tribal identity. So the other thing is, like, my partner is now the president of the Oglala Sioux tribe, and it's his birthday, by the way. Kevin Killer, like, shout out to you.
Shout out, Kevin. Happy birthday.
He has a May the 4th be with you birthday. So the force is strong with him. But we talk about this, and it's like every tribe has a different level for identifying their members. So asking even that question is homogenizing our identity, right? Because it's like, oh, it's the same across it's not. It's very different from every group. And we have over 566 federally recognized tribes, not to mention state or unrecognized, for that matter. So just digging in deep and trying to understand who you're talking to, whose story you're sharing, what's their culture. I always tell, when I talk to studios, I tell them every tribe has cultural nuances because we're very experiential teachers. So you learn by being there. You learn by somebody showing you. I remember taking a friend to the Sundance, and she'd be like, well, what's going to happen? She's Irish, and I worked with her at the church, and she was like, I want to know what's going on. What's going to happen when this happens? And I was like, I didn't know how to explain it to her. I said to her, I was like, you'll see, because everybody's experience is different. And for Native people, it's about you having your own experience in that setting, right? It's not, no one is telling you what your experience is. It's your own experience. I see we have something else.
Yes, we have another question from Rabbi Jonathan Fryer. Have you found any successful method towards helping people lead with more open questions? How do we help well-intentioned people overcome their own shame spirals?
Yeah. It's so fascinating because I feel, in all of my teaching of even the curriculum around the doctrine of discovery, by the way, there's a curriculum still floating out there from the Episcopal Church. We actually did a curriculum for people to go through this history. So I'm sure you could probably still find it on the Episcopal Church website. But part of it is just, I feel like, confronting that history yourself of watching more movies. I mean, I learned about QAnon through Netflix, right? Like we can learn about all this stuff from different shows. Right now, I'm in the middle of watching Exterminate the Roots, which is also on, I think that's on HBO actually. But this is about the history of many tribes that have been colonized under, and people of color under, you know, Exterminate the Roots, the othering of our people. So, and I remember just also knowing your triggers, right? I mean, that's, I get it from my sister tells me this stuff, like, what's your trigger? I was talking with the same colleague when we were teaching the Doctrine of Discovery work to a bunch of deacons, and we would talk, and this is something that goes on behind the scenes, right? I was like, so you say white privilege first, I'll say it second, so that people, maybe they will get triggered if you say white privilege, and like people won't leave when I say white privilege. I mean, there was still a deacon that walked out when I said white privilege. And they were triggered by me saying that, because I apparently, you know, for them, maybe that saying it, for, you know, me saying it was offensive because they didn't want to hear it from somebody like me, because there's so much that goes into it, right? I mean, we are all living on land that was taken by force from Native people. And even after agreements of treaty agreements and all that, still taken by force and by mass murder. And yeah, it's a lot to deal with, but if we don't deal with it, you know, I feel like we're never going to heal. And so for me, healing really does require truth telling, but I would say it also requires listening and acknowledging and understanding that on your own individual level, as well as a collective level, within your institutions, within your communities, of understanding those different levels of oppression as well.
Great, Sarah, thank you. So this will be our last question during our session today. What is your view of individuals claiming 1 to 2% Native Americans in context of employment? How do Native Hawaiians experience similar how are Native Hawaiians experiences similar to Native Americans?
So I'm not going to answer that question directly, because it's like me talking about somebody else's community. So I feel like that's not really fair either. I'm not Hawaiian. Like I'm not, I said to somebody, I was like, I don't want to be the Indian police. Like, you know, I don't want to.
Understood. We call it spokesperson syndrome.
Yeah. Well, and I think for me, like it goes back to, did they actually grow up in that community? Do they actually have an authentic connection to that community? And that's really what it goes back to. I mean, I have cousins that are like blonde haired and like blue eyed, but they grew up in that community and they know all of the traditions and cultures of that community. They've done their work, they've been invested, you know, they have their family there. So everybody's experience is different, but I think you have to ask yourself, I mean, also like be willing and comfortable to go a little bit deeper in, you know, learning more about that person really. And how is that going to benefit your company or the work that you do?
Sarah, I just don't even have the words to thank you for what you shared with us today, the power and the vulnerability and the grace that you've shared with us today. I think will be with us for a very long time to come. Thank you so much for opening our first virtual summit and for being with us. And I see this as the part of a long relationship with you and your work. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
So as we close today, I'd just like to remind everyone that our workplace team will be following up with you all via email with a recording of today's keynote and related resources. I also want to acknowledge our team, Nina Bowe, who has been the manager and director of this year's virtual summit, Cameron Smith, Leslie Funk, and Melinda Zalma, our new manager of programs. Thank you all for everything that you're doing to bring this amazing programming to everyone. We'd like to make sure that you all know about our upcoming sessions, and next week on Tuesday, May 11th at 12 o'clock, we will be having our session called Purposeful Discussions with Learning from Tanenbaum's Peacemakers in Action Network. If you haven't already registered for this session or the following ones, please note the registration link that's being shared in the chat. And please share the registration link with those who you believe would benefit or would enjoy the conversations that we're having today. I'd like to thank you all again for joining us. Thanks to our sponsor, the Walt Disney Company. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you again next week.